The first time Marcus saw Rachel cry, it wasn't because he'd said no. It was because she'd said yes. They were sitting in his car outside her apartment, the small one-bedroom she'd moved into after leaving her old life behind. 3 months clean, 2 months in church, 1 month of him noticing her in the third row, always arriving late, always leaving early, always alone. He'd asked her to coffee, then dinner, then a walk by the lake where she told him everything. The clubs, the men, the pills that made time move differently, the abortion at 22 that she'd paid for with money from a man whose last name she never learned, the years she'd spent so far from God she forgot what his voice sounded like. "I'm not that person anymore," she'd said, her voice small. "I know I can't undo it, but I'm not her." He'd taken her hand. "I know," he'd said, "I see who you are now." And when he asked her to be his girlfriend 2 weeks later, officially, publicly, the kind of relationship that meant introducing her to his small group and his family, she'd cried. "You really want this?" she'd whispered. "You really want me?" Yes. She'd believed him. That was 8 months ago. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. They were planning a future, talking about it the way people do when they're testing the weight of forever. She'd mentioned marriage casually, the way you mention a destination you both know you're driving toward. He'd gone quiet. "What?" she'd asked, smiling. "Too soon?" "No, it's just," he'd set down his fork. "Rachel, I need to be honest with you about something." The air in the restaurant had changed. "I love you," he'd said. "I need you to know that first. I love who you are, who you've become, what God's done in your life. It's beautiful. You're beautiful." But her voice had already gone flat. "But I don't know if I can marry you." Silence. "Because of my past, not a question." It's not about judgment. I've prayed about this, I've really prayed, and I keep feeling this, check, this hesitation. I don't know if I can build a life with someone who," he'd stopped, started again. "My kids, our kids, how do I explain to them that their mother?" "Say it," her voice was ice, finish the sentence. "That their mother was a different person before Christ." "We are all different people before Christ, Marcus. That's literally the whole point." "I know, but there are levels." "Levels?" She'd laughed sharp, bitter. "So my sin has levels, your pride doesn't, your judgment doesn't, but my past, the one I confessed, the one I repented for, the one I've been actively healing from, that has levels." "Rachel, do you know what it cost me to tell you?" Her voice had started shaking. "Do you have any idea what it took to stand in front of you and show you every ugly thing I've ever done and trust you with it? I gave you ammunition, Marcus, and now you're using it." "I'm not using anything, I'm being honest." "You're being a coward," she'd stood up. "You love me enough to date me, to fix me, to parade me around as your little redemption project, but not enough to actually marry me, not enough to attach your name to mine when people ask questions." "That's not fair." "No," she'd grabbed her purse. "What's not fair is that you made me believe you were different, that you saw me, but you just see my past, and you always will." She'd left. He'd sat there for 20 minutes, staring at her unfinished meal, telling himself he'd done the right thing. They didn't speak for 3 weeks. Marcus told himself this was good, necessary, that he needed clarity, needed to pray through it, needed to be sure. But the truth was uglier. He was waiting for the guilt to stop feeling like guilt and start feeling like conviction. His small group confirmed what he wanted to hear. "Man, you have to think long-term," Derek had said over wings and beer. "Marriage is hard enough without that kind of baggage. My cousin married a girl with a past like that. It came up every fight, every argument. You're just like all the other men. You don't want that weight." "Right," Marcus had said. But Rachel had never said that. Not once. She'd never weaponized her past. She just trusted him with it. Plus, Tyler had added, "You're a youth pastor. Kids look up to you. You need a wife who can stand on stage with you, you know. Someone whose testimony builds the ministry instead of complicating it." Marcus had nodded. But something in his chest had twisted. Complicating it. As if a woman's redemption was an inconvenience to his career. His pastor had been more careful. Pastor Jean had sat across from him in the church office, hands folded, expression unreadable. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, Marcus. This is between you and God. I know, I need wisdom." "Then let me ask you something." Pastor Jean's voice was gentle. "Are you protecting your future family, or are you protecting your image?" The question had landed like a fist. I'm protecting them, Marcus had said quickly, too quickly. How? From complications, from judgment, from having to explain. Explain what? That their mother was saved by grace, that she's living proof of what God can do with a surrendered life. Pastor Jean had leaned forward. Or are you afraid they'll have to explain why their father couldn't see past her past? Marcus had felt his throat close. I'm not judging her. Then what are you doing? He hadn't answered. Pastor Jean had sighed. I've been in ministry 40 years, son, and I've watched a lot of men make a lot of decisions. The ones I've seen regret the most. They're not the ones who loved too recklessly. They're the ones who loved too carefully, who chose safety over surrender, who mistook their fear for God's voice. Marcus had left that office more confused than when he'd entered. His mother had been the most direct. She seems sweet, baby, she'd said over Sunday dinner, but you're a youth pastor, you're visible, people look up to you. I know. You need a wife with a testimony people can celebrate, not one they'll whisper about. She'd reached across the table, squeezed his hand. There's nothing wrong with having standards, Marcus. God honors that. And that word, standards, had settled over him like a blanket. Yes, that's what this was, standards, wisdom, discernment. Not judgment, not fear, not the barely concealed pride of a man who needed his wife to make him look good. Standards. For 2 weeks he'd wrapped himself in that word. He'd prayed, asking God to confirm he'd made the right choice, and when no lightning bolt of conviction came, he took the silence as approval. He'd read Proverbs about choosing a wife carefully, 2 Corinthians about not being unequally yoked. He'd built a theological fortress around his decision and manned the walls. But late at night, alone, the fortress would crack. He'd remember the way Rachel had looked at him when she told him about the abortion, the shame in her voice, the way she'd said, I know I can't undo it. He'd remember the way she'd cried when he asked her to be his girlfriend, the disbelief, the hope. He'd remember her face in the restaurant, the moment she'd realized he'd been judging her the whole time. You just see my past, and you always will. And in those moments, alone in the dark, Marcus would feel something he didn't have a name for yet. Not quite guilt, not quite regret. Something worse, the first whisper of a truth he'd spend the next 11 years running from. What if I just made the worst mistake of my life? He tried to call her twice. The first time, he'd stared at her name in his phone for 20 minutes before closing it, told himself he needed more time to think. The second time he'd let it ring, she didn't answer, he didn't leave a voicemail. What would he say? I'm sorry for treating your redemption like a liability. I'm sorry for loving you like a project instead of a person. I'm sorry I needed you to be perfect instead of just healed. He told himself she was better off without him. He told himself this was God protecting her. He told himself he'd done the honorable thing by being honest instead of marrying her while harboring doubts. He told himself 100 things. He believed none of them. When he heard she'd left the church, something in him broke. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a hairline fracture that would spread slowly over the next decade until there was nothing left that wasn't broken. He told himself it was for the best, that she needed space to heal, that God would lead her somewhere new. But he knew. He knew he'd sent her back into the wilderness by refusing to love her the way Christ had, without conditions, without a scorecard, without fear. And he knew he was too much of a coward to go after her. So he didn't. He met Jennifer 4 months later. Rachel left the church 6 weeks later. He heard about it from someone in the choir. Yeah, she just stopped coming. Shame, she was really growing. He'd tried to call her. She didn't answer. He'd gone to her apartment. She'd moved. He told himself it was for the best, that she needed to heal without him, that maybe this was God's way of closing a door that shouldn't have been opened. He met Jennifer 4 months later. Pastor's daughter, worship leader, the kind of woman his mother called a blessing before they'd even been introduced. Jennifer was good, genuinely good, not performed, not calculated. She brought meals to sick members without being asked. She remembered people's prayer requests. She loved Jesus with a steady, uncomplicated devotion that never questioned, never wrestled, never doubted. Marcus told himself this was better, safer, This was what godly love was supposed to look like. They were engaged in 6 months, married in a year. On their wedding night, Jennifer had held his face in her hands and said, "I'm so glad God gave me someone with such a pure heart." He'd smiled. He'd lied. The first year, he convinced himself he was happy. Jennifer was everything a wife should be. She supported his ministry. She kept a beautiful home. She never questioned him, never challenged him, never asked him to be more than what he presented. And that was the problem. Rachel had seen him, had looked past his youth pastor persona and found the man underneath, the one who was afraid of being ordinary, who used righteousness as a shield, who needed control more than he needed connection. Jennifer only saw what he showed her, and she loved it, all of it, without knowing any of it was real. Year 2, he started having the dream. He was at the altar, but it wasn't Jennifer standing across from him, it was Rachel, and when the pastor said, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," Marcus opened his mouth and said, "I can't do this." And Rachel would look at him with those eyes, not angry, just tired, and say, "I know." Then she'd walk away. And he'd wake up next to Jennifer, her hand resting on his chest, her breath soft and even, and he'd feel like he was suffocating. Year 3, Jennifer got pregnant. He'd held the positive test in his hands and felt nothing, then hated himself for feeling nothing, then performed joy so convincingly that Jennifer never questioned it. His daughter was born on a Tuesday. They named her Grace. Jennifer had looked up at him from the hospital bed, exhausted and radiant, and said, "Our miracle, God is so good." "Yes," he'd said. And he'd meant it, God was good. But Marcus wasn't sure he was. Year 5, he stopped being able to pray. Not publicly, he could still perform that, could still bow his head at small group and youth events and family dinners, and say words that sounded like communion with God. But alone, in the dark, when he tried to pray, all he heard was Rachel's voice. "You just see my past, and you always will." He told himself he'd made the wise choice, the righteous one, that protecting his future family from complications was biblical, mature, responsible. But late at night, watching Jennifer sleep beside him, he'd wonder, what was I actually protecting, them, or my reputation? He never let himself answer. Year 7, Jennifer found him crying in his office at church. "Baby, what's wrong?" She'd knelt beside his chair, concerned, loving. "I don't know," he'd said, and it was the most honest thing he'd told her in 7 years. "Are you struggling with something, spiritually?" "Yes, I refused to marry a woman I loved because I was afraid of what people would think. I married you because you made me look good, and I don't know who I am anymore." "Just tired," he'd said. "Youth ministry is draining." She'd prayed over him, beautiful, earnest prayers about strength and renewal and God's sustaining grace. He'd said amen. He'd felt nothing. Year 11, he'd stopped fighting it. He loved Jennifer, he did, the way you love someone who's only ever been kind to you, who's built a life with you, who deserves better than what you've given her. But he wasn't in love with her, had never been, had chosen her because she was safe, acceptable, uncomplicated. Had chosen her because she'd never require him to be brave. And Rachel, wherever she was, whatever she was doing, had required everything from him. His honesty, his courage, his willingness to love something that didn't fit the mold. And he'd refused. Not because she wasn't worth it. Because he wasn't. He saw her again 11 years later. He was at a conference, one of those massive Christian gatherings with thousands of attendees and dozens of breakout sessions. He'd been leading a workshop on youth ministry. She was leading one on recovery and redemption. He'd walked past the room by accident, glanced at the schedule posted outside, and saw her name. Rachel Bennett, From Chains to Freedom, a testimony of God's redemptive love. His heart had stopped. He'd stood in the hallway for 10 minutes, debating. Then he'd walked in. The room was packed, standing room only. He'd squeezed into a spot by the back wall. And then she'd started speaking. She was different. Not just older, though she was, they both were, but different. There was a weight to her now, a gravity, the kind that comes from having walked through fire and come out holding something precious. She told her story, all of it, The clubs, the men, the abortion, the pills. She didn't spare the details, didn't sanitize it for the church crowd. But then she told the rest. I met a man, she said, her voice steady, who told me he loved me, who told me he saw who I was becoming, who made me believe that my past didn't define me. She paused. And then when it mattered, when I needed him to actually believe that, he told me he couldn't marry me because my past was too much, too messy, too complicated for his future. Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. I left the church after that, she continued, not because I was angry at God, but because I couldn't sit in a room full of people who preached grace on Sunday and practiced judgment Monday through Saturday. I couldn't worship beside people who loved the idea of redemption, but were terrified of the reality of it. The room was silent. I spent 2 years in the wilderness, angry, hurt, convinced that if that's what Christian love looked like, I wanted nothing to do with it. She smiled, sad knowing, but God doesn't let go easy. He found me in a 12-step meeting in a basement of a church I'd never heard of. Found me through a woman named Sharon who'd been sober for 30 years and loved Jesus with a fire I'd never seen. She told me something I'll never forget. Rachel's voice grew stronger. She said, "Baby girl, his rejection wasn't God's rejection. It was just a man too small to hold what God was doing in you." Marcus felt tears on his face. So I came back, not to the same church, not to the same people. I came back to God, and He rebuilt me, gave me a ministry I never imagined, gave me a husband. She held up her hand, showing a wedding ring, who sees my past as a testimony, not a disqualification. Gave me 2 daughters who will grow up knowing that no mistake is bigger than God's mercy. She was married. She had children. She had a life. And he'd almost stolen it from her with his cowardice. "If you're here tonight carrying shame," Rachel said, looking out over the crowd, "from something you did before Christ, I need you to hear me. You are not too much. Your past is not too messy. Your story is not too complicated. And anyone who tells you that your redemption has an expiration date does not understand the God we serve." The room erupted in applause. Marcus couldn't move. He waited until the crowd cleared. She was packing up her notes when she saw him. Her face didn't change. No anger, no surprise, just a calm, measured recognition. "Marcus." "Rachel," his voice cracked. Can I talk to you, just for a minute?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay." They walked to a quiet corner of the convention center. He couldn't find words, couldn't figure out how to start. "You have a family," he finally said. "I do. You're doing incredible work." "God's doing incredible work, I'm just showing up." "Rachel," he stopped, started again. I'm so sorry, for what I said, for what I did, for making you feel like your past was bigger than God's grace. I was wrong, his voice broke. I was a coward." She nodded slowly. "Yes, you were." The words hit like a slap. "But you were also exactly what I needed," she continued. "I don't mean that in a nice way. I mean I had built my entire recovery around being accepted by someone like you, someone respectable, someone who could validate that I was really changed. And when you rejected me, it destroyed that foundation. It forced me to find my identity somewhere else, in God, not in your approval, not in the church's approval, in *him. Marcus felt his throat close. "So thank you," she said, not unkindly, not cruelly, just honestly. "Thank you for showing me that human love has limits, because it taught me that God's doesn't." "I think about you," he whispered. "All the time, I think about what I lost." "You didn't lose me, Marcus. You refused me, there's a difference." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "I need to go, my husband's waiting." "Rachel." She turned back. "Are you happy?" he asked. She smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile that comes from a soul that's been rebuilt from the ground up. "Yes," she said, "I'm free." She walked away. Marcus stood in the empty hallway, surrounded by the noise of 1,000 Christians talking about grace, and realized he'd spent 11 years married to the wrong woman because he'd been too afraid to marry the right one. Not because Rachel was perfect, but because she'd needed a love big enough to hold her scars. And he'd offered her a love with conditions. That night, Marcus sat in his hotel room and opened his Bible for the first time in months. Not because he was disciplined, because he was desperate. He turned to Luke 7, the woman with the alabaster jar, the one who'd wept at Jesus' feet while the Pharisees judged her, the one Jesus defended with words that now felt like an indictment. Her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown, but whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Marcus had spent his entire Christian life being forgiven little. Not because he hadn't sinned, but because he'd never been honest about it, never been broken enough to need the kind of grace that rebuilds from the foundation. He'd judged Rachel for needing that grace. And in doing so, he'd revealed that he didn't really believe in it at all. He closed the Bible, picked up his phone, looked at Jennifer's last text, "Hope your workshop went well, love you." She was a good woman. She deserved better than a man who'd spent 11 years of marriage loving a ghost. He didn't know what to do with that knowledge. But he knew this. He'd told himself he was protecting his future when he refused to marry Rachel. In reality, he'd been protecting his image. And it had cost him everything that mattered. This is for the man who thinks some sins are too big for grace, who preaches redemption but practices respectability, who loves the testimony but fears the person. You didn't dodge a bullet, you refused a blessing, and the woman you rejected, she doesn't need your validation anymore. She found a love that doesn't flinch at scars. She's free. Are you?